When most people think of illegal wildlife trafficking, they picture ivory, elephant tusks carved into decorative objects, moving through black market channels from African poachers to Asian collectors, or rhino horn, ground into powder, sold for thousands of dollars per kilogram on the basis of entirely unfounded medicinal claims. These are real and serious problems. But neither ivory nor rhino horn is the most trafficked wildlife product in the world by volume and by value. That distinction belongs to a tree, specifically to the group of tropical hardwoods known collectively as rosewood. The global rosewood trade, driven primarily by demand for high-end furniture in China, where certain rosewood species have been prized for centuries and where a growing wealthy class has generated explosive new demand in the 21st century, moves hundreds of millions of dollars worth of illegal timber every year. It has stripped protected forest across Madagascar, Southeast Asia, West Africa, and Latin America. It funds criminal networks with the organizational sophistication of narcotics traffickers. And it operates, for the most part, in a regulatory environment that has historically been inadequate to the scale of the problem. The Chinese term hongmu refers to a category of precious hardwoods traditionally used in fine Chinese furniture, a category that includes rosewoods of several botanical families. Hongmu furniture has been valued in China for hundreds of years. Pieces from the Ming and Qing dynasties are among the most prized objects in Chinese decorative arts, and genuine antiques command prices at auction that rival old master paintings. The explosive growth of China's middle and upper class in the first 2 decades of the 21st century generated a corresponding explosion in demand for hongmu furniture. Millions of newly wealthy Chinese consumers wanted the status signifier that hongmu furniture represented, and they had the money to buy it. New hongmu furniture, made from freshly cut rosewood rather than antique pieces, became a multi-billion-dollar domestic market. The trees that supply this market are found in tropical forests across 3 continents. The specific species most prized, Dalbergia, the true rosewoods, and Pterocarpus, which includes varieties known as Paddock and African rosewood, grow slowly. Some of the most sought-after species take a century or more to reach harvestable size. They cannot be quickly replanted and harvested on a cycle that meets commercial demand. They are functionally a non-renewable resource on any commercially relevant timescale. The response of the market to this mismatch between supply and demand was predictable. As legal sources were depleted and regulated, illegal sources filled the gap. Madagascar is perhaps the most dramatic example of what rosewood trafficking looks like on the ground. The island nation off the east coast of Africa contains some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. Forests found nowhere else, populated by species found nowhere else. These forests contain stands of Dalbergia rosewood that are among the most valuable timber on the planet. They are also legally protected, located within national parks, and have been subject to international export bans for years. None of this has stopped the logging. During periods of political instability, particularly following a coup in 2009 that removed Madagascar's president and left the country in a governance vacuum, rosewood traffickers moved into protected areas with chainsaws and human labor on a massive scale. They operated openly, bribing local officials, paying workers from desperately poor communities, and moving logs to coastal ports for export in containers labeled as other goods. The logs went primarily to China. Researchers tracking container shipments, using satellite imagery and port records, documented the movement of tens of thousands of tons of Malagasy rosewood to Chinese ports during peak trafficking periods, despite the logs being under international trade prohibition. At the Chinese end, the material entered legitimate furniture manufacturing without effective scrutiny of its origin. The forests that were lost cannot be recovered on any human timescale. The species composition of the logged areas, the specific mix of rare plants, insects, reptiles, and mammals that depended on those particular trees, is permanently altered. Madagascar has lost a fraction of an irreplaceable ecosystem to supply a furniture market in a country 7,000 miles away. The organizational structure of Rosewood trafficking networks has, in many documented cases, displayed the characteristics of mature organized crime rather than opportunistic poaching. In West Africa, particularly in Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Gambia, where African rosewood, Pterocarpus erinaceus, has been heavily targeted, Chinese-led trafficking networks have been documented operating with significant logistical sophistication. These networks typically involve Chinese nationals who serve as financiers and export coordinators, local intermediaries who manage relationships with corrupt officials and organize logging operations, and laborers recruited from local communities with cash payments. The timber is laundered through chains of documentation, false certificates of origin, fraudulent species declarations on export paperwork, transit through third countries with weaker enforcement. By the time rosewood reaches a furniture factory in Guangdong province, its provenance is buried under layers of paperwork that make verification practically impossible without the kind of forensic analysis that customs authorities rarely have the resources or the mandate to conduct. The cash flows involved are large enough to distort local economies. In some West African communities where rosewood trafficking was active, the sudden influx of cash from logging operations temporarily raised local incomes, creating short-term economic dependence on the illegal trade that complicated law enforcement responses. Arresting the loggers meant eliminating an income source for communities with few alternatives. The regulatory framework for rosewood has strengthened significantly over the past decade, but enforcement has lagged. In 2013, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, known as CITES, added several rosewood species to its Appendix 2 list, requiring export permits and legal acquisition documentation. In 2017, a nearly comprehensive listing was added covering the entire Dalbergia genus, essentially all true rosewoods globally. This was the largest listing of a plant group in CITES history. The listings have not stopped the trade. They have raised compliance costs, created a more elaborate documentation laundering industry, and in some cases pushed trafficking into species and regions not yet covered by regulations. The fundamental driver, extremely high prices for a product that consumers in the destination market are not required to verify, remains intact. Demand-side interventions have been attempted with limited success. Chinese government campaigns promoting green furniture and raising awareness of the conservation implications of homemade production have had some effect at the margin. Several major Chinese furniture manufacturers have publicly committed to legal sourcing verification. The effectiveness of these commitments in practice, absent third-party auditing, is difficult to assess. There is a particular cruelty in the rosewood trade that distinguishes it from other forms of resource extraction, even at comparable scales. Forests are not simply accumulations of timber. They are complex biological systems that have developed over centuries into specific ecological communities. A rosewood tree that takes 100 years to grow has spent that century becoming part of an ecosystem, providing habitat, producing fruit, building soil, cycling water. The network of relationships between the tree and the organisms that depend on it is intricate and largely unmapped. When a tree is logged, the timber value is extracted in hours. The ecological value that took a century to accumulate is destroyed simultaneously. The furniture that results from this process has an average lifespan of perhaps a generation before it is replaced. A piece of homemade furniture that sat in a display case for 20 years and was then discarded represents, at the extreme, a century of ecosystem development converted into 2 decades of interior decoration. This is not an argument against wood furniture or against the traditions that make rosewood valuable in Chinese culture. It is an argument about rate and scale, about the mismatch between how fast living systems accumulate value and how fast commercial demand destroys it. The mathematics of a trade are straightforward. The forests are finite. The demand is not. Without a fundamental change in how origin is verified and how consumer demand is shaped, the trajectory leads to one end.